New Jersey, 2018. I sat in the living room with the TV flickering in front of me, the rest of the house drenched in darkness. The room felt larger in the low light, every shadow stretching just a little too far into the corners. The open floor plan didn't help either. The empty space behind me made my skin crawl, like there was something there just out of sight, waiting. I kept glancing over my shoulder, telling myself I was being ridiculous, trying to laugh it off, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. After the movie ended, I brushed my teeth, shut off the lights, and crawled into bed. The silence was instant, heavy, pressing against me. I drifted off quickly, exhaustion taking over, but I didn't sleep long. A noise pulled me out of a restless slumber. It was distant at first, just enough to tug me from the edge of sleep. It sounded like a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakably familiar. My sister, or at least I thought it was her. Her voice was calling my name from somewhere downstairs, the syllables slow and deliberate. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up in bed, trying to shake off the haze. Why would she be downstairs at this hour? I thought maybe she had come home without telling me, but something about the way she was calling me felt off. There was no urgency in her tone, just a strange flatness, as if she was calling me not because she needed something, but because she wanted to see what I would do. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from the darkened floor below. The voice echoed through the stillness of the house, hollow and unsettling. Every instinct told me to stay in bed, to lock the door and wait until morning, but curiosity tugged at me like a lead weight. I got up, switched on the hallway light, and crept toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound magnified by the silence around me. As I descended, the dim light from the hallway above barely reached the lower floor, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The voice called my name again, soft but insistent, like it was drifting through the walls. I turned into the small foyer that led to my sister's side of the house, searching for the light switch. My fingers fumbled in the dark until I found it, flicking it on with a sense of relief. But the relief didn't last. The light was dim, flickering slightly, and the room looked wrong. There was no sign of my sister, no bags, no shoes, nothing to indicate that she was even home. The air felt still, unnaturally heavy, as if something was watching me from the shadows beyond the weak glow of the light. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed, straining to hear anything, a creak of the floor, the shuffle of feet, anything that could explain the voice I had heard. But the house remained silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Then I saw it. A figure moved just at the edge of my vision, slipping into the darkened kitchen. My heart stuttered, and a wave of cold fear washed over me. It wasn't my sister. The person was too tall, their silhouette too unfamiliar. I backed up, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't turn toward me, just melted into the shadows like they had always belonged there. My breath hitched as I took a step back toward the stairs, desperate to put some distance between me and whoever was in the house. That's when the lights went out. Everything plunged into darkness, and I felt my pulse explode in my chest. The soft hum of the refrigerator stopped, and the house fell completely silent. I stood frozen in place, my body unwilling to move, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But all I could hear was my own breathing, sharp, uneven gasps cutting through the stillness. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward me from the kitchen. My hands fumbled for the wall, searching blindly for the staircase. The footsteps were getting closer, each one heavy and measured, like the person was savoring every step. I found the edge of the staircase, just as I felt a shift in the air, the unmistakable presence of someone standing only feet away from me. I bolted up the stairs, heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. The footsteps followed, steady and unhurried, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, pressing my ear to the wood. The footsteps stopped just outside. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that wraps around you and squeezes. Then I heard the faintest sound, the soft scrape of nails dragging lightly down the door, slow and deliberate. My skin crawled, and every muscle in my body tensed as I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next. But nothing happened. The dragging stopped, and the footsteps retreated, fading slowly down the hall. I stayed pressed against the door until my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. The house was silent again, but the air still felt thick with the presence of something unseen, something waiting just beyond the door. The next morning, I found no trace of anyone. No open doors, no signs of a break-in, just the lingering weight of what had happened in the dark. My sister hadn't come home at all, and when I tried to tell her what I'd heard, she brushed it off. I still live in that house, but I never leave my bedroom door unlocked anymore. And every so often, late at night, I think I hear it again, just the faintest scrape of nails against the wood, reminding me that I'm never really alone. Maine, 2022. The air grew cooler as the last light slipped behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the surface of the water. I tried to shake the growing unease settling in my chest. Maybe it was a deer or a hiker, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. The brush rustled again, closer this time, and I tightened my grip on the paddle. Then I saw him. A man stood just at the water's edge, holding a large, rusted barrel tilted on its side. The slosh of liquid echoed across the lake as he tipped the barrel, spilling its contents into the water. Even in the dim light, I could see the thick, dark fluid spreading across the surface, creeping outward in ribbons. It wasn't oil, it was something thicker, something darker. A knot twisted in my stomach. I tried to convince myself that I should just paddle away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But my instinct to say something took over. I shouted toward the shore, my voice echoing awkwardly across the still water. The man froze. For a moment, he didn't look at me, just stood there motionless, as if weighing his next move. Then, without a word, he dropped the barrel and slipped back into the forest, vanishing into the thick undergrowth. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat in my kayak, feeling the weight of the still water pressing against the hull. The only sound was the soft lapping of the contaminated water against my paddle. The smell hit me next, sharp, metallic, and wrong. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But something about the way the man had disappeared gnawed at me, freezing me in place. The forest felt too quiet now, like it was waiting for something. I began paddling back to shore, every muscle in my arms tight with tension. The kayak sliced through the water, leaving ripples behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I neared the shoreline, I heard it, a sharp crack, the sound of a footstep on dry twigs. I stopped paddling, my breath catching in my throat. The forest was still again, but I knew he was there, somewhere close. I reached the shore, pulling the kayak up onto the muddied bank as quickly as I could. Every instinct screamed at me to leave everything behind, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon my gear. My hands shook as I covered the kayak with a tarp, trying to appear calm, as if that would change anything. Then, just as I was about to turn toward the path back home, I heard it, a deliberate, heavy step from the forest, followed by another. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was coming closer. I didn't wait to see him again. I grabbed my gear and ran, pushed my way through the dense undergrowth, branches scratching at my arms and legs. The forest felt endless, the path twisting and unfamiliar in the fading light. Every snap of a twig behind me sent jolts of fear through my chest. By the time I reached my house, I was gasping for air, the door slamming shut behind me with a deafening thud. I locked it, double-checked the windows, and stood there in the dark, waiting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The man never followed me, at least not that I know of, but I stopped going to the lake after that. I left the kayak there, rotting under the tarp, too afraid to retrieve it. Every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I think I can smell that sharp, metallic scent again, like it followed me home. Kentucky, 2017. It was late at night, and I had just stepped outside the back door of my apartment to get to my car. My dogs were already asleep, and my roommates were inside, unaware of what was about to unfold. The parking lot behind the building was quiet, dimly lit by the old, flickering streetlights. The night air felt unusually still, the cold pressing against my skin as I walked along the narrow cement pathway lined with thick pine trees. The silence around me deepened with each step, making the sound of my own breathing unnaturally loud. I glanced around as I unlocked the car just out of habit, but the feeling that someone was nearby gnawed at me. That's when I saw him. A figure emerged from the dark, coming from behind the row of trees. He was tall, dressed in loose clothing that seemed damp and heavy. He wasn't running, but walking briskly, straight toward me. My heart slammed against my chest as I fumbled with the car door, adrenaline igniting every nerve in my body. The way he moved wasn't casual. It was deliberate, as though he had been waiting for me to come outside. I yanked the car door open, but instead of getting in, I turned and bolted back toward the apartment building. I could hear the dull thud of his footsteps speeding up behind me, closing the distance. The door to the building was just a few feet away. Every muscle in my legs burned as I sprinted, knowing I had only seconds before he caught up. My hands trembled as I reached the door, yanked it open, and slammed it shut behind me, the metallic click of the lock barely registering through the ringing in my ears. I stood there, chest heaving, pressing my ear to the door. The other side was silent. For a moment, I thought maybe he had turned away, but I knew better. I crept toward the small peephole, squinting through it into the dim, empty hallway beyond. There was no one there, or so it seemed. Then I heard it, a soft scuffling sound, followed by a light knock, 3 precise taps on the door. My breath hitched. He hadn't left. He was standing right outside, waiting. I backed away from the door, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the fear that making any noise might provoke him kept me frozen in place. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. He wasn't leaving. The hallway outside my apartment stretched long and narrow, with 2 back windows at the far end. Windows I realized with a sinking feeling that were unlocked. I ran down the hall, my heart hammering against my ribs as I reached the windows and threw the latch into place. The cold glass pressed against my fingertips, and that's when I saw him again. He was outside, standing just beyond the reach of the window, his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me. The same slow, deliberate grin spread across his face. I couldn't look away, couldn't breathe. He raised a hand and scratched lightly at the glass with his fingernail, slow, dragging strokes that sent chills down my spine. For a moment, I thought he was going to break in, thought he would climb through the window and end whatever game he had started. But instead, he took a step back, gave one final glance, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the tree line. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the next few hours sitting in my room, every muscle locked with tension, listening for any sound that might mean he had come back. But the only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of the wind and the distant hum of cars on the highway. Even now, I don't know who he was or why he followed me that night. I try to tell myself it was just a coincidence, just someone passing through. But the way he smiled, asterisk, asterisk, the way he seemed to know exactly where I would be, asterisk, asterisk, makes me think otherwise. To this day, I can't walk to my car without feeling the weight of his presence just behind me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down again. Arizona, 2021. I had booked an Airbnb near the outskirts of a small desert town for a job interview. It was isolated, but the price was right, and I figured the quiet would help me focus. I had no idea just how alone I would feel by the time my stay ended. The house sat on a dead-end dirt road, surrounded by nothing but dry bushes and cracked earth stretching into the horizon. The desert had a way of making everything feel distant, like the rest of the world was just out of reach. It was the first night, and I was on my laptop practicing for the interview when I heard a soft tap on the window. I froze, the sound so light it could have been anything, a tree branch, a moth. But there were no trees near the windows, and something about the rhythm of it, too deliberate, made my skin crawl. The room fell silent, save for the dull hum of the ceiling fan above me. I stared at the dark glass for a long moment before forcing myself to look outside. There was nothing, only the endless stretch of desert and the faint outline of the hills in the distance, barely illuminated by the porch light. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to my laptop, but the uneasy feeling stuck to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The next day after the interview, I spent some time in the backyard, soaking in the sun and trying to relax. The sky was wide and cloudless, a bright, suffocating expanse that felt almost too open. But even under the sun, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced at the surrounding landscape, I expected to see someone, a dark figure just at the edge of visibility, crouching behind a bush or standing still among the cacti. That night, I settled in to watch a show, trying to unwind, when I heard it again, another tap at the window. My heart stuttered, and I sat perfectly still, staring at the glass. This time it wasn't a random knock. It was deliberate, like a fingertip lightly tracing the surface. I got up slowly and crept toward the window, every muscle tense. The desert outside was empty again, but the silence pressed in too hard, too thick. I opened the front door and peered into the darkness, hoping to catch someone in the act. But all I heard was the soft rustle of the wind stirring the dry brush, and then a sound that froze me in place. A click, the kind people make by pressing their tongues against the roofs of their mouths. It was faint, coming from somewhere beyond the circle of light cast by the porch, hidden just out of sight. I strained my ears, waiting, feeling my pulse thud in my throat. Another click followed, this one closer. I scanned the darkness, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just beyond the bushes, motionless, dressed in dark clothes that blended seamlessly with the night. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his gaze pinned on me, unwavering. I wanted to shout, tell him to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound, except for one more deliberate click with his tongue. I took a step back toward the door, my hand fumbling to grab the handle. The man shifted then, not running, not rushing, just slowly turning and walking away, dragging his feet as if he knew there was no need to hurry. I locked the door and stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the house sending my nerves into overdrive. I checked the windows constantly, half expecting to see him standing there again, just outside, waiting for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I packed my things and left before dawn. As I drove down the empty road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see him trailing behind me, just far enough to stay out of reach. To this day, I still wonder if it was the Airbnb host messing with me, or if it was someone else entirely. Whoever he was, he knew exactly how to make me feel like I was being hunted. I've never rented an Airbnb since, and I can't pass through that part of Arizona without the unsettling memory creeping back. The man who clicked his tongue in the dark, as if to say, I'll see you again. Small town, winter 2019, around 4:45 a.m. Just as I was restocking the shelves behind the counter, the sound of the bell above the door startled me. A man stepped in, dragging a suitcase behind him. At first, I thought nothing of it. People pass through with luggage all the time. Travelers stopping on their way to catch early flights or truck drivers on cross-country hauls. But something about him felt wrong. He was soaked from the rain outside, his clothes clinging to his skin, and his suitcase looked old, worn to the point of fraying at the seams. His eyes were bloodshot, the kind of red you'd get after days without sleep. I gave him a polite nod, hoping to avoid conversation. He didn't respond. Instead, he parked the suitcase by the door and wandered slowly through the aisles. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, too slow, as if he were deliberately stalling for time. My stomach tightened as I watched him from behind the counter. He wasn't picking anything up, just running his fingers across the shelves, letting them linger on random items. Candy bars, magazines, cans of soup. It felt more like he was searching for something or someone. I tried to distract myself by checking the time and organizing receipts, but every time I glanced back, he was closer. The way he navigated the aisles didn't feel random. It felt calculated, as if he was testing the limits of the space between us. My pulse quickened when I realized he was now in the aisle nearest the counter, barely a few feet away. The suitcase sat by the door, untouched. It hadn't left my mind. Something about the way he had left it there deliberately gnawed at me. People don't just abandon their luggage at the entrance of a store. Not like that. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the nagging sense of unease refused to leave. He finally stopped at the counter, resting his hands flat on the surface. His fingernails were dirty, cracked, and caked with something dark. He looked at me for the first time, and I felt the weight of his stare. It wasn't just tired or distant. It was hollow, like someone who'd seen things they couldn't unsee. The store was dead silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. I tried not to meet his gaze, focusing instead on the cash register, waiting for him to say something. But he didn't. He just stood there motionless. And then, without a word, he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that didn't touch his eyes. The hairs on my arms stood on end. That grin wasn't friendly. It was a warning. I felt the instinct to reach for my phone under the counter, to have it ready just in case, but my hand froze. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the air thick with tension. Then, as abruptly as he had arrived, he turned and walked back toward the door. He didn't take anything, didn't say a word, just grabbed the handle of his suitcase and dragged it out into the rain. I exhaled a shaky breath, feeling my muscles unclench, but the relief didn't last long. Through the store's front windows, I watched him pause just beyond the lot, standing under a streetlight. He opened the suitcase, rummaged through it, and pulled something out, a small plastic bag, dark and wet. I couldn't make out what was inside, but whatever it was, it didn't look right. The suitcase still lay open at his feet as he glanced back toward the gas station, meeting my eyes through the glass. His grin widened, impossibly larger this time, a twisted stretch of satisfaction. And then, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, he turned and vanished into the rain, dragging the suitcase behind him. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, my heart racing every time the bell above the door rang. I couldn't stop thinking about that plastic bag, about what it might have contained, and about the way he'd smiled, like he knew something I didn't. When my shift finally ended, I sat in my car, staring at the rain-slicked streets, half expecting him to appear in the rearview mirror. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird encounter with a strange man. But deep down, I knew better. That smile wasn't something I could forget. To this day, I can't drive past that gas station without feeling the chill of that night all over again. And every time I see someone with a suitcase, especially in the early hours of the morning, I wonder if it's him still out there, dragging something far more sinister than clothes behind him.
Subscribe.
Connecticut, autumn 2020. I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace, looking for cheap decorations to get our new house ready for fall. I stumbled on a listing that seemed perfect. A huge storage bin packed with seasonal decorations for only $20. The seller's profile seemed normal enough, and I figured it would be a quick, harmless pickup. It wasn't. I arranged to pick up the bin later that evening, thinking it would be a straightforward transaction. The address was in a small town about 30 minutes away, tucked along back roads surrounded by thick woods. The air was cold, and the sun had already set by the time I arrived at the house. The property looked ordinary. A simple ranch-style home with 2 cars in the driveway and a dim porch light flickering over the front steps. But something about it didn't sit right. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life inside. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid as I parked the car and texted the seller that I had arrived. A few minutes passed, and no one came out. The silence felt too heavy, pressing down on the night like a weight. I debated leaving, but just as I was about to turn the key in the ignition, a shadow shifted by the side of the house. A man appeared, dragging a large plastic storage bin behind him. I got out of the car, forcing a polite smile. He moved slowly, too slowly, as if each step was deliberate. The bin scraped against the concrete, making a sharp, grating noise that set my teeth on edge. As I approached, the man stopped abruptly, standing just outside the glow of the porch light. His face was obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap, and his clothes were baggy, stained, and damp in places. He didn't speak or offer any greeting, just stared at me with a kind of cold detachment. I glanced at the bin, trying to focus on the task at hand. The lid was slightly ajar, and I could see fake leaves and plastic pumpkins poking out from inside. But as I bent down to lift it, something shifted beneath the decorations, something heavier than plastic decor. A wave of unease rolled through me. The air around us felt thicker, colder, as if the night had tightened its grip. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But when I reached down to grab the handle, the bin felt too heavy, far heavier than it should have been. The man just stood there, unmoving, watching me with that same blank stare. I could feel his eyes drilling into me, waiting to see what I would do. My hands trembled as I tried to lift the bin, the weight of it dragging against the ground, unnatural and wrong. Then, in the dim porch light, I noticed something, a small, red smear on the edge of the lid. Just a hint of it, barely visible, but enough to make my stomach churn. The man took a step closer. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was testing my reaction. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a drumbeat of fear that drowned out everything else. I let go of the bin and stepped back, forcing my body to remain still when every instinct screamed at me to run. He didn't say a word, just stared, his breath visible in the cold night air, steady and unbothered. I knew, in that moment, that I needed to leave. Whatever was inside that bin wasn't just decorations, and whatever this man was doing here, I didn't want to find out. I muttered a quick excuse, backing toward my car without turning my back on him. The man didn't stop me, didn't try to follow. He just stood there, motionless, watching as I climbed into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, locking it in one fluid motion, and reversed down the driveway without waiting to see if he would react. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing in the same spot, watching me leave. The bin sat at his feet, the lid slightly open, as if waiting for someone else to come along. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station on the main road, my heart still hammering against my ribs. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'd barely escaped something terrible that night, something that would have stayed with me forever. I deleted Facebook Marketplace from my phone as soon as I got home, and I never mentioned the incident to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about that bin, what was really inside it, and what would have happened if I had tried to take it with me. And every time I pass a yard sale or see a listing online, I feel the weight of that night press against me, as if reminding me that not every deal is worth taking. Texas, 2006. The night was darker than usual, and the familiar 15-minute walk to my neighborhood seemed to stretch infinitely. Earlier in the day, a tragic announcement at school had left everyone on edge. A classmate had been killed in a hit-and-run. Her name was Elise, a freshman. I didn't know her well, but the grim detail that the driver had escaped shook me. As someone who walked home alone from school, it was impossible to ignore the gnawing thought. What if I was next? I left a friend's house late that evening, pretending my dad was picking me up, not wanting to trouble anyone for a ride. The streets were nearly deserted, and I regretted every step as I took a poorly lit back road to save time. A cool breeze brushed against my skin, but it did nothing to calm my anxiety. Halfway through the stretch of dark pavement, the street lamps died simultaneously. The sudden plunge into blackness made my pulse race. I stopped in my tracks, trying to steady my breath and let my eyes adjust. There was no moonlight, just the distant hum of the city in the background. Then I heard it, a distant, guttural sound of an engine roaring to life. My heart dropped. The sound was close, way too close for comfort, and it was unmistakably that of a muscle car, a low, rumbling growl like the ones showcased at car shows. But there were no headlights, no glow of taillights, just the menacing purr of a car revving in the dark. I told myself it was just some old car left running, that it had nothing to do with the tragedy from last week. But fear is rarely rational, and my instincts screamed otherwise. The street ahead curved sharply, blocking my view beyond the bend. And that's when it happened. The unmistakable sound of tires squealing, accelerating toward me from the darkness. I froze. For a second, I couldn't move, but the headlights snapped on, blinding, aggressive beams illuminating the narrow road. The growl of the engine turned into a full-throated roar as the vehicle tore through the night, aiming directly for me. It was charging like a bull, and I was standing in its path. I barely managed to leap aside, diving toward the grass along the sidewalk. The whoosh of metal missed me by inches, and I hit the ground hard, my palms scraping against the cold concrete. The car's tires shrieked as it skidded to a halt, but when I looked up, breathless and trembling, there was nothing. Just silence. The car and its driver had vanished. I stumbled to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribcage. The street lamps flickered back to life, casting their dim glow over the road. No tire marks. No fading engine noise. No sign of anything. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was drunker than I thought. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew. I saw the car. I felt the brush of death as it missed me. And there was no mistaking the screech of tires. When I reached home, I locked every door and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the pounding in my chest wouldn't slow. I never reported it. What was I supposed to say? That a car tried to kill me, then disappeared into thin air. A week later, the police closed Elise's case, citing lack of evidence. The driver was never caught. I still walk that road sometimes, mostly during the day, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. But every now and then, when I hear the low hum of an engine, my heart races. Because I know, whether it's paranoia or something worse, that car is still out there. And next time, I might not be fast enough. Texas, 2006. The night was darker than usual, and the familiar 15-minute walk to my neighborhood seemed to stretch infinitely. Earlier in the day, a tragic announcement at school had left everyone on edge. A classmate had been killed in a hit-and-run. Her name was Elise, a freshman. I didn't know her well, but the grim detail that the driver had escaped shook me. As someone who walked home alone from school, it was impossible to ignore the gnawing thought. What if I was next? I left a friend's house late that evening, pretending my dad was picking me up, not wanting to trouble anyone for a ride. The streets were nearly deserted, and I regretted every step as I took a poorly lit back road to save time. A cool breeze brushed against my skin, but it did nothing to calm my anxiety. Halfway through the stretch of dark pavement, the street lamps died simultaneously. The sudden plunge into blackness made my pulse race. I stopped in my tracks, trying to steady my breath and let my eyes adjust. There was no moonlight, just the distant hum of the city in the background. Then I heard it, a distant, guttural sound of an engine roaring to life. My heart dropped. The sound was close, way too close for comfort, and it was unmistakably that of a muscle car, a low, rumbling growl like the ones showcased at car shows. But there were no headlights, no glow of taillights, just the menacing purr of a car revving in the dark. I told myself it was just some old car left running, that it had nothing to do with the tragedy from last week. But fear is rarely rational, and my instinct screamed otherwise. The street ahead curved sharply, blocking my view beyond the bend. And that's when it happened. The unmistakable sound of tires squealing, accelerating toward me from the darkness. I froze. For a second, I couldn't move, but the headlights snapped on, blinding, aggressive beams illuminating the narrow road. The growl of the engine turned into a full-throated roar as the vehicle tore through the night, aiming directly for me. It was charging like a bull, and I was standing in its path. I barely managed to leap aside, diving toward the grass along the sidewalk. The whoosh of metal missed me by inches, and I hit the ground hard, my palms scraping against the cold concrete. The car's tires shrieked as it skidded to a halt, but when I looked up, breathless and trembling, there was nothing. Just silence. The car and its driver had vanished. I stumbled to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribcage. The street lamps flickered back to life, casting their dim glow over the road. No tire marks. No fading engine noise. No sign of anything. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was drunker than I thought. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew. I saw the car. I felt the brush of death as it missed me. And there was no mistaking the screech of tires. When I reached home, I locked every door and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the pounding in my chest wouldn't slow. I never reported it. What was I supposed to say? That a car tried to kill me, then disappeared into thin air? A week later, the police closed Elise's case, citing lack of evidence. The driver was never caught. I still walk that road sometimes, mostly during the day, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. But every now and then, when I hear the low hum of an engine, my heart races. Because I know, whether it's paranoia or something worse, that car is still out there. And next time, I might not be fast enough.
Subscribe.
Southern California, 2011. The park was only a few blocks away from our apartment, surrounded by thick bushes and towering trees that swayed under the faintest breeze. During the day, the place was lively, filled with joggers, families, and kids feeding the geese. Now, in the deep quiet of the night, it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. The moon reflected off the still water of the small lake, casting ripples of silver that shimmered and faded as the breeze brushed the surface. The occasional feather drifted lazily along the shore, remnants from the geese that had crowded the park earlier. We hadn't planned on going out that night, but the apartment had become stifling, heavy with the summer heat. My boyfriend and I needed the open air to clear our heads. We walked hand in hand through the park gates, the gravel crunching softly beneath our shoes, and found an old bench by the water. It felt safe enough, like the darkness was a blanket that would shield us from the rest of the world for a little while. For a moment, everything was perfect. The cool breeze made my skin tingle, a pleasant contrast to the warm night air. I closed my eyes, enjoying the stillness. The world seemed far away, just a faint hum of traffic in the distance, distant headlights blinking through gaps in the trees. My boyfriend sat beside me, relaxed, his long hair falling in soft waves over his shoulders. I leaned into him, enjoying the quiet. Then, out of nowhere, headlights pierced the darkness, cutting through the tree line at the edge of the park. A police cruiser bounced over the parking lot's speed bumps, the blue and red lights flashing silently, like an urgent warning that didn't belong in the stillness of the night. My heart jumped into my throat. We weren't supposed to be here. The park was technically closed, and we weren't exactly in the right state of mind. The alcohol we'd sipped earlier was still warm in my veins, making the edges of reality feel soft and hazy. I glanced at my boyfriend. He was thinking the same thing I was. Running would only make things worse. We stayed put on the bench, trying to look casual, as if we hadn't noticed the police car at all. My pulse pounded in my ears, each thump counting down the seconds until the officer would get out and ask what we were doing. But he didn't. The car rolled to a stop at the far end of the parking lot, and the spotlight snapped on, a harsh, blinding beam that swept through the trees, bouncing off the branches, searching. At first, I thought he was looking for us, but the beam didn't linger on the bench. Instead, it cut across the water and fixed on a dense patch of bushes near the tree line. The beam was steady, unwavering, locked onto something hidden among the branches. I followed the light, squinting to make out what the officer had seen, but the shadows were too thick. A knot twisted in my stomach, and the air around me felt heavier, as if it were thickening with some unseen threat. The longer the spotlight stayed trained on that spot, the more the unease settled into my bones. My mouth went dry, and the cool night air suddenly felt colder, as if a shift had taken place, a change that I couldn't quite put into words. Then the officer got out of the car. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel as he made his way toward us. I braced myself for the scolding I thought was coming. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel the tension in my boyfriend beside me, as if we were two animals caught in a snare. But the officer didn't tell us to leave. He stopped a few feet away, just outside the circle of moonlight, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes flicked toward the bushes, and then to us. There was something strange in the way he looked at us. Not anger, not suspicion, but something deeper. A kind of urgency that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. When he told us to leave, his voice was flat and final, like the kind of warning you don't question. I felt a chill run through me, and every instinct told me to listen. As we stood up from the bench, my legs felt weak, my knees wobbly. The officer's gaze flicked back toward the bushes one last time before he turned toward his car. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told us that someone had been hiding in the bushes, watching us. Someone had been crouched just a few feet away the entire time. My stomach dropped, the weight of his words sinking in slowly, like a stone falling through deep water. Someone had been there, hidden in the dark, waiting for something. The officer said the man had been moving closer, step by step, inching toward us without making a sound. I felt the ground sway beneath me, as if the world had shifted on its axis. The rustling leaves we had heard earlier, the crack of a branch snapping underfoot, it hadn't been the wind or an animal. It had been him. We didn't need to be told twice. My boyfriend grabbed my hand, and we walked quickly, almost running, toward the exit. I could feel the officer's eyes on us, watching as we disappeared down the path, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. The walk home was a blur of fear and confusion. Every time a leaf rustled or a shadow shifted, I felt my chest tighten with panic. My mind raced through every possibility. Who had been watching us, what they wanted, how long they had been there without us noticing. And then another thought struck me, a realization that hit harder than anything else. The man in the bushes had mistaken my boyfriend for a second girl. His long hair, the way we sat close together. To someone watching from the shadows, it must have looked like we were two women sitting alone in the dark. The nausea hit me in waves. What had that person been planning? What would have happened if the officer hadn't shown up when he did? I squeezed my boyfriend's hand tighter as we hurried down the street, trying to outrun the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment building made my heart race, and every shadow felt like it was hiding someone just out of sight. My boyfriend stayed silent, shaken in a way I had never seen before. Neither of us wanted to say it aloud, but we both knew the truth. If that officer hadn't arrived when he did, we might not have made it out of that park. We never went back to that park again. Even now, years later, I avoid parks at night altogether. There's something about empty spaces in the dark, a sense of waiting, of something unseen just beyond the reach of the light. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that the man in the bushes is still out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake we did. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.